The little girl bit down to the bone. Caleb Holt felt the teeth break his skin before he saw her face. 7 years old, frost on her lashes, wrapped in a dead man's coat 3 sizes too big, crouched in the corner of a stranger's stable, while December in Wyoming tried its level best to kill her. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just bit him and stared at him with brown eyes that had already decided every adult in the world was a liar. She was right about most of them. She was wrong about him. But she didn't know that yet. Stay with us until the very end of this story. Drop a comment with your city so we can see how far Norah's story reaches. Hit that like button and subscribe to follow every step of this journey. You will not want to miss what comes next. The blizzard had been coming since noon. Caleb knew it the way men who'd spent years moving through open country learned to know things. Not from looking at the sky, but from the way his mare, Delia, had started pulling left against the rains 3 miles outside of Salvation Creek, trying to turn her nose into the wind and understand what was building behind those mountains. The air had that smell to it, metal and cold and something older than either. The kind of smell that told a man he had maybe 2 hours before the world disappeared into white. He made it into town with 40 minutes to spare. Salvation Creek, Wyoming Territory. December of 1879 wasn't much to look at in good weather. In weather like this, it was a collection of shapes in the dark. A general store with a light in the window. A saloon with noise leaking under the door. A church at the end of the main road standing quiet and dark, like it had already given up on the people inside it. One hotel, one sheriff's office, a scattering of houses with smoke coming out of chimneys that told you someone inside was warm and intended to stay that way. Caleb wasn't looking for warmth. He was looking for a place to put Delia for the night so she didn't freeze in the street, which was what was going to happen if he didn't find a stable in the next 15 minutes. His hands were already bad. The cold always did it. Locked up the knuckles of his right hand where the bullet had passed through 3 years ago. Made the fingers curl inward like they were trying to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. He'd learned to work around it. He'd learned to work around a lot of things. The livery stable sat at the south end of town, back from the main road, half hidden behind a hardware building with a broken sign. Caleb rode Delia up to it, swung down before she'd fully stopped. She knew the routine, and pushed open the big sliding door with his shoulder. The smell hit him first. Horses and hay and cold straw and something underneath that didn't belong. Something sharper. Something human. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. 8 stalls, 4 horses, a tack wall on the left side hung with bridles and rope, and a single lantern burning low enough that it barely pushed the dark back 2 feet. Hay bales stacked against the far wall. And in the last stall on the right, the one with a broken latch, something moved. Caleb didn't reach for his gun. He'd stopped carrying one on his hip 8 months ago, and he didn't miss it. Instead, he just stood still and listened, the way his father had taught him when he was 12 years old in Pennsylvania. If you're patient enough, everything that's hiding will eventually breathe. He heard breathing. Small breathing. Fast and shallow. The kind that came from cold or fear or both. He walked down the center aisle, slow, no sudden movements, the way you approached a spooked horse. He got to the last stall and looked over the half door. She was wedged into the back corner, behind a water trough, underneath a man's overcoat that was so large it covered everything except her face and 2 bare feet poking out from the bottom hem. The feet were the color of old wax. She'd been here a while, long enough that the cold had started working on her. She looked up at him. Brown eyes, dark, almost black in the low light. Not scared. That was the first thing he noticed. Not scared. Calculating. the way an animal calculates when it's decided that fighting is the only option left. "You with Greer?" she said. Her voice was steady. He'd known soldiers who couldn't keep their voices that steady in worse situations. "I don't know who Greer is," Caleb said. "I just need to put my horse up for the night." She watched him. Didn't move. Didn't speak. "You got a name?" he asked. "You first." "Caleb Holt." "What do you want?" "Already told you. My horse needs a stall. Blizzard's coming." "It's already here," she said. And she was right. He could hear it now. The wind picking up outside. The walls of the stable starting to creak under the first real pressure of it. "Most of the stalls are empty. Take one of those." "I will." He didn't move. "How long you been in here?" Her chin came up. Small movement. Big meaning. "That ain't your business." "Those feet are your business. They're the wrong color." She looked down at her feet like she'd forgotten they were attached to her, then pulled the coat tighter so they disappeared. "They're fine." "They're not fine. They're close to frostbite." He studied her face. 7, maybe 8. Small for whatever age she was, with frost melting on her eyelashes and her hair. Blonde, he could see that much. Plastered against her forehead from old sweat and newer cold. "What are you doing out here alone?" "Waiting." "For who?" Something crossed her face. Gone so fast he almost missed it. Pain, moving through like weather, there and then buried back under all that careful stillness. "Nobody," she said. "Not anymore." Caleb reached over the stall door, not toward her, toward the latch, to open it. He was going to get her inside the main building, find the stable owner, figure out who this child belonged to, and get her somewhere warm before those feet got any worse. That was when she bit him. He didn't see her move. 1 second she was in the back corner, the next she was at the door, and her teeth were in his left hand, locked down over the knuckles, and she was holding on with everything she had. Not wild, not panicked. Deliberate. The bite of someone who'd done it before and knew exactly how hard to clamp down to make a grown man take his hand back. Caleb took his hand back. He looked at the blood on his knuckles, looked at her. She'd retreated to the corner again, breathing harder now, feet apart, arms loose at her sides. Ready. "I ain't going to the home," she said. "I ain't going back there. You can tell Mr. Greer I'm dead if you want. Tell him whatever you want, but I ain't going." Caleb put his hand against his coat to stop the bleeding, and stood there in the cold and the hay smell and the sound of the blizzard building itself into something serious outside, and looked at this child who'd drawn his blood without blinking, and was now staring at him like she was prepared to do it again. "I don't know who Greer is," he said again, patient, level, the same voice he'd used on spooked horses and frightened people for 36 years. "I'm a stranger passing through. I've got a lame horse and nowhere to be and no interest in whatever's going on in this town between you and whoever you're hiding from." He paused. "But I'm not walking away and leaving you in here with those feet." "Why not?" The question was genuine, not defiant, just honest. "Nobody else did anything, and they all know me." That sentence landed on Caleb like a stone dropped from height. He pulled the stall door open, slow, leaving her every route of escape she had, and sat down in the hay beside the water trough, with his back against the wall. Not standing over her, not between her and the door, just down on her level, with his elbows on his knees and his hat pushed back. "What's your name?" he asked. She watched him from the corner, that measuring look, dark eyes moving over his face like she was looking for the part where he lied. "Norah," she said finally. Norah Bell Hayes. How old are you, Norah Bell Hayes? 7, almost 8. You hungry? He watched her jaw tighten, pride doing battle with a stomach that hadn't been properly filled in days, and pride was losing. Maybe? He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, slow, so she could see his hands the whole time, and pulled out what was left of the bread and jerk meat he'd bought in the last town 2 days back. He set it on top of the water trough, where she could reach it without coming near him, and moved his hand away. She didn't take it. Not yet. She stared at it like it might have conditions attached. No conditions, Caleb said, like he'd read her mind. Food's just food. People don't just give things, Norah said. They always want something back. Some people do. Not all. All the ones I've met. He didn't argue with that. A 7-year-old child who'd arrived at that conclusion had earned it honestly, and he wasn't going to tell her she was wrong based on 2 minutes of acquaintance. Instead, he waited, and after a while she crossed the stall in 2 quick steps, grabbed the food, and retreated back to her corner, and ate with her back against the wall, and her eyes on him the whole time. She ate fast, the way someone eats when they've learned that food can be taken back. Your papa's the one that worked the mine? Caleb asked, keeping his voice easy, conversational, like it didn't matter. Like he hadn't already put together most of the answer from what he'd seen and heard since he'd ridden into town. The dark windows of the company bunkhouses. The way the men at the livery had looked away when he'd asked about places to stay. The black crepe hanging on 2 doors he'd passed on the main road. Norah stopped chewing. He was. Was. Past tense. The saddest word in the English language when it came from a child. He'd die in the cave-in? Caleb asked. She looked at him sharply. How do you know about that? Men were talking at the edge of town when I rode in. Said there was an accident last month. 6 men. 3 weeks ago, Norah said, precise, like the number of days mattered, like counting them was all she had left. December 4th. She finished the last of the bread and held the empty hands in her lap and stared at them. Mama died when I was born, so it was just me and Papa. Her voice was flat. The flatness of someone who'd already cried everything out and was now on the other side of crying, in the dry country that came after. Papa said if anything ever happened, I should go to Uncle Roy in Cheyenne. Except Uncle Roy died in the spring, and Papa didn't know yet because the letter got lost. She paused. I found out when I went to the post office to send a telegram. The telegraph man told me. He said, "Your uncle's been dead 6 months, girl, so you might as well stop trying." Caleb's jaw tightened. He kept it off his face, but it tightened. "What about Mr. Greer?" he asked. "Who is he?" "He owns the mine." Her voice changed, something hard moving into it, replacing the flatness. "He came to our house, 3 days after the funeral. Said the company owned the dwelling and we needed to vacate by end of week. We, meaning me, said the territory had a home for children in my situation, and he'd arranged for me to go." She pulled the big coat tighter around herself. "Except I heard Jimmy Alcott, that's the Reverend's boy. I heard him tell his friend that the home Greer arranges children to go to isn't really a home. It's the mine over in Tucker County. They use the children to work the shallow tunnels because grown men are too big to fit." The stable walls shook. Outside, the blizzard was no longer building. It had arrived, fully formed and furious, the way Wyoming winters announce themselves. The temperature inside the stable had dropped 10 degrees in the last 20 minutes. Caleb could see his breath, and he could see Norah's, and he could see that her lips were starting to go pale at the edges. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "In this stable?" 2 nights. 2 nights. 2 nights in an unheated stable in December in Wyoming territory, with bare feet and a dead man's coat, and whatever scraps she'd managed to find. He thought about that, thought about it long enough to feel the full weight of it, then set it aside, because feeling it wasn't going to help her right now. "I need to get you somewhere warm," he said. "No." The word came out fast, hard, a door slamming shut. "That's what the last man said, before I bit him." "Smart." He meant it. "Where'd he take you?" "Tried to take me to the home. I got loose at the door." She held up her left wrist, and he could see the bruise there, purple-green, the shape of fingers that had held too hard. "I run fast." Caleb looked at that bruise for a moment and felt something old move through his chest. Something he'd spent 3 years trying not to feel, since the day he'd walked away from the Pinkerton agency and the man he'd been when he worked for it. He'd given orders once that had left marks like that on people. Not directly, not with his own hands. But the paper he'd signed had sent men who did, and he'd told himself it wasn't the same thing, and he'd been wrong, and he'd known he was wrong the moment the ink dried, and he'd done it anyway. He was done doing things he knew were wrong. "Is there anyone in this town," he said carefully, "who hasn't already tried to hand you over to Greer?" Norah thought about it, genuinely thought, chewing the inside of her cheek, going through the residents of Salvation Creek one by one. "Miss Prentice," she said, "the teacher. She came to the company house the day after the funeral and brought me a pie and sat with me for 2 hours and said she was going to find a solution." She paused. "That was 18 days ago. She hasn't come back." "Maybe she got scared." "Maybe." Norah's voice was without judgment. "Adults get scared. They stop doing things." "Some do." "Most." "Not all." He stood up from the hay. "I'm going to go find Miss Prentice." Norah looked up at him from the floor, and for the first time there was something in her face besides calculation. Something younger. Something that wanted badly to believe him and was fighting equally hard not to. "And then what?" "Then we figure out the next step." "What if she won't help?" "Then I find someone who will." "And if you can't find anyone?" Caleb looked at this child, 7 years old, frostbitten, alone, crouching in the dark with bite marks already from fighting back against people 3 times her size. And he felt the same thing he'd been running from for 3 years click into place inside him. Not a feeling he'd planned on. Not a feeling he'd asked for. Just a fact. The way facts sometimes arrived, fully formed and immovable, without waiting for permission. "Then I'll figure it out myself," he said. She stared at him. "You don't know me. I bit you." "I've been bitten before." "Not like that." "I bit a man last Tuesday, hard enough he needed the doctor." "Good aim?" She blinked. "What?" "You hit somewhere useful, or just wherever you could reach?" The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but close enough to see the shape of where one might go, crossed her mouth. Knuckle of his thumb. He couldn't hold a fork for 2 days. "Useful placement." Caleb picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the trough, put it back on his head. "You sit tight. Stay in this stall, away from the door. I'll be back in 20 minutes. "People always say they'll come back." He stopped with his hand on the stall door, turned back to look at her, this small, fierce, frozen child who had survived something that would have finished most adults, and was now calmly informing him that she no longer believed in the basic reliability of human beings. He understood that. He didn't blame her for it. He also wasn't going to lie to her. "I know they do," he said. "And I know that doesn't mean much coming from someone who just walked in out of a blizzard. So I won't tell you to trust me. I'll say this. I'm leaving my mare in the next stall. Delia doesn't stay anywhere I'm not coming back to. Norah looked at the bay mare in the opposite stall, who was pulling thoughtfully at a mouthful of hay and paying no attention to any of this. Then she looked back at Caleb. "What's wrong with her left leg?" He stopped. "Stone bruise." "How'd you know?" "Way she stands. Papa taught me." Her voice thinned on the last two words, and then steadied. "He was good with horses. Better than anyone." "I believe it." She looked at him for a long moment, those dark, calculating eyes doing their measuring work. Then she nodded. One small nod. Not trust. Not yet. But the possibility of it, thin as paper, barely there, extended across the cold air of the stable, like a hand reaching in the dark and hoping to find something solid. Caleb walked out into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a wall. Temperature had dropped another 15 degrees since he'd been inside, and the wind was coming down from the north with a kind of intention that made it clear this wasn't passing through. This was settling in. Snow was already 3 inches deep on the main road and coming down hard enough that he could see maybe 20 feet ahead of him. The town had gone quiet, the way towns did when the weather got serious. Doors shut, lights behind curtains, the whole of Salvation Creek pulling inward like a fist. He found the general store first. The sign above the door read, "Coldwell General Merchandise." Faded, but legible. The light inside was the only honest light he'd seen since he rode in. Warm and yellow, visible through the front window. He pushed through the door, and the bell above it rang. The woman behind the counter was maybe 50, gray-haired, with a face that had been pretty once, and was now formidable in the way that some women became formidable when life required it of them. Strong bones, sharp eyes, hands that had worked for decades and showed it. She looked up from the ledger she was writing in and took him in the way a woman takes in a stranger. Full assessment, nothing missed. Opinion formed before he'd said a word. "We're closing," she said. "I know, I'll be quick." He pulled the door shut behind him and stood on the mat so he didn't track snow across her floor. "I'm looking for a woman named Miss Prentice, the schoolteacher. I was told she lives in town." The woman's pen stopped. "Who's asking?" "Caleb Holt. Just rode in. I've got a situation that needs her help tonight." "What kind of situation?" "The 7-year-old kind." The woman set her pen down with the care of someone controlling a strong reaction. Her eyes were sharp, brown, already knowing what he was talking about before he said another word. "You found Norah Hayes." "She found me, or her teeth found me. Same result." He pulled his left hand out of his pocket and showed her the bite mark. Something moved across the woman's face. Not softness. She didn't appear to be a woman built for softness. But something. A recalibration. "She's alive," the woman said. Not a question. More like a fact she'd been afraid to check on for days. "She's alive, and she's frostbitten, and she's been living in a horse stall for 2 nights, Mrs. Coldwell. Margaret Coldwell." She didn't offer a hand. She was already moving, coming around the counter, reaching for her coat on the hook by the door. "I put food out for her twice, left it by the stable door. Didn't know if she was getting it." She paused with her coat half on and looked at him directly. "Why are you doing this? You don't know that child." "No, ma'am, I don't." He held the door open for her, and the cold came through like a fist. "I reckon somebody had to." Margaret Coldwell looked at him for one long moment with those sharp brown eyes. And whatever she saw, it moved her. Not toward warmth. He didn't think warmth was in her immediate range. But toward action. And right now, action was what mattered. "Dorothy Prentice lives on Oak Street," she said, and walked out into the blizzard. "Follow me. Try to keep up." The schoolteacher's house was the fourth one down, small and square, with a light in every window and a wreath of dried sage on the door that had gone gray with the cold. Margaret knocked like someone who didn't ask permission from doors. 3 hard raps, no waiting. The woman who opened it was younger than Caleb expected, 34 maybe, with black hair escaping a loose knot at the back of her neck, and ink on her left hand, and the expression of someone who'd been sitting alone with a difficult problem for too many days, and was startled to find the problem coming to her door in the form of 2 snow-covered strangers. "Mag," she said, "what?" "He found Norah," Margaret said. "She's in Donovan's stable. Alive. Frostbitten. He needs your help." Dorothy Prentice looked at Caleb. He looked back. Something passed between them that wasn't introduction. It was recognition. The quick mutual assessment of 2 people who had just been thrown into the same urgent situation and were deciding in real time whether the other person was competent. "How bad are the feet?" Dorothy asked. "Bad enough," Caleb said. "Not black yet. Close." She was already reaching for her coat. "Come in out of the cold, both of you. I need 2 minutes, and then we're going back out there." She disappeared into the house, and Caleb stepped inside out of the blizzard for the first time in an hour. The house was warm. Books on every surface, papers stacked by the fireplace, a lesson slate on the table covered in sums that hadn't been erased yet. He looked at the slate and thought about a 7-year-old girl crouching in the dark, saying her father was going to teach her things that never got taught. And he pressed his hat between his hands and stared at the floor. "You're passing through," Margaret said from behind him. Not a question. "Was planning to." "Planning's changed." He turned to look at her. She stood by the door with her arms crossed and her chin up, watching him with that evaluating stare. "You've got that look," she said. "Man who picks something up and doesn't know yet if he's going to put it back down." "What look is that?" "Like you're calculating whether you can afford what you're about to do." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the blizzard threw itself against the windows, and the house held. "Can't afford it," he said finally. "Nobody can. That's not the question." She uncrossed her arms and looked away from him toward the fire. "The question's what you do anyway." Dorothy came back with a satchel over her shoulder and a pair of wool stockings in her hand, and a face that had made up its mind. "I've got salve and bandages, and if those feet need more than that, I'll need Dr. Harriman, and that's going to be a different conversation entirely." She looked at Caleb steadily. "After we get her settled, what's your plan?" "Working on it." "Work faster." She opened the front door. "Harrison Greer has 2 men in this town whose job it is to find that girl before she freezes to death, so he can claim he was trying to help her when he hands her to the Tucker County operation. If she's found in that stable, she's gone by morning." "Then she won't be in that stable by morning," Caleb said. Dorothy held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she nodded once and walked out into the blizzard, and Caleb followed. And Margaret Coldwell fell into step beside him without being asked, because whatever Margaret Coldwell decided to do, she did it all the way. 3 people walking through a December blizzard in Wyoming territory toward a child in a horse stall who'd bitten the last man who tried to help her. The cold pressed down from every direction. The snow swallowed their footprints as fast as they made them. Caleb kept walking. Norah was still in the corner when they got back. She heard them coming before they reached the stall. Caleb could tell by the way she'd shifted position, putting the water trough between herself and the door, weight forward on her toes, ready. When he slid the door open and she saw it was him, something in her posture changed. Not relaxed, not yet, but the specific readiness of someone prepared to fight shifted into the different readiness of someone prepared to run, and that was at least a degree of improvement. Then she saw the 2 women behind him, and her eyes went quick and sharp between all three of them, and she said, "That's too many people." "I know," Caleb said. "Can't be helped. Miss Prentice needs to look at your feet." Norah looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked back at her, and whatever passed between them in that moment was older than either of them. The particular recognition of a woman who had spent years watching children be failed by the world, and a child who had spent her entire short life being failed by it. "Hey, Norah," Dorothy said quietly, not reaching, not moving forward, just standing in the doorway with her hands visible and her voice steady. "I'm sorry I didn't come back sooner. That was wrong of me, and I should have been braver." The silence in the stable had a texture to it. Wind outside, horses breathing, the low creak of the walls. "Why weren't you?" Norah asked. "Because Mr. Greer came to see me," Dorothy said, "the day after I visited you. He told me if I interfered with the territory's arrangements for orphaned children, I'd lose my teaching position." She paused. "And I was scared, and I let that stop me, and I'm ashamed of it." "Are you still scared?" "Yes." Dorothy didn't hesitate. "But I'm here anyway." Norah looked at her for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes. Then she looked at Caleb. "You got her here fast." "Mrs. Coldwell helped." Norah looked at Margaret, who was standing slightly back from the others with her arms crossed, and her face in that careful configuration that wasn't warmth, but wasn't coldness either. Just the face of a woman who'd learned to hold herself very still when she felt too much. "You put food by the door," Norah said. "Twice," Margaret said. "Didn't know if you found it." "I found it, both times." A pause. "Thank you." Margaret's jaw worked. "Don't thank me. I should have done more." She said it like it cost her something to say it, like the words had to be pulled out past something that had been sitting on them for weeks. Dorothy crossed the stall then, slow and easy, and crouched down in front of Norah and opened her satchel. "I need to check your feet. I'm not going to touch them without asking first. Can I?" Norah sat down in the hay and pulled the big coat back from her feet and held them out with the matter-of-fact endurance of a child who'd learned that pain was just information and there was no use performing around it. Dorothy's face stayed neutral as she examined them, but her hands were very careful and her jaw was set in the way of someone controlling a strong reaction. "They're cold," Dorothy said. "Real cold, but the color's coming back a little since you've been in here. The two smallest toes on your left foot worry me more than the rest." She opened the satchel and started taking out what she'd brought. "I'm going to put salve on them and wrap them, and then we're going to get you somewhere warm enough for your body to do the rest of the work." She looked up at Norah. "This is going to hurt when the feeling comes back." "I know," Norah said. "Papa told me about frostbite. He said the hurting means it's healing." Her voice stayed even on his name, but her hands gripped the coat in her lap. "He said most things hurt more when they're getting better than when they're getting worse." "He was right about that," Dorothy said. Caleb stood at the stall door and watched Dorothy work, and Margaret stood beside him, and for a while the only sounds were the wind and the horses and the small, careful sounds of a woman tending to a child. He'd seen a lot of things in 36 years that had required him to keep moving and not look too long at what was in front of him. He was finding it harder to keep moving lately. He wasn't sure if that was weakness or something else. "Where are we taking her?" Margaret asked, low, beside him. "Not for the room, just for him." "That's what I'm working on." "She can't stay in my store. Greer's men know every building on the main road." "I know." "And she can't stay with Dorothy. They'll look there first. After tonight, Dorothy's already made herself a target by being here." "I know that too." Margaret turned to look at him with those brown eyes that didn't miss anything. "You have somewhere in mind." It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. "Hotel first. Get her warm, get her fed, let her sleep in a real bed tonight. Tomorrow, I'll figure out the next step." He paused. Is there a judge in this territory who'd override Greer's arrangements? Margaret was quiet for a moment. There's Judge Hereford in Cheyenne. He's been on the bench 20 years, and he's not owned by anyone as far as I know. But Cheyenne is 40 miles, and that road is closed until the blizzard breaks. Could be 3 days. Could be a week. 3 days to a week with Greer's men in town and a 7-year-old girl who couldn't run fast enough in frozen feet. Caleb did the math and didn't like what it came to. What about the sheriff? Margaret made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Wade McAllister is a decent man, in an indecent position. Greer funds half the county operations. McAllister knows what's happening with those children, and he hates himself for it. But he's not going to move against Greer openly. Not without something bigger than one man passing through town and saying the arrangement is wrong. Then we don't go to him yet, Caleb said. We go to the hotel. Dorothy finished wrapping Norah's feet and helped her into the wool stockings she'd brought. And then Caleb looked at Norah and said, Can you walk? I can walk. You don't have to prove it to me. I can carry you if the feet are bad. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since the beginning. That constant calibration, measuring the distance between what people said and what they meant. You'd carry me. If you needed it, yes. Why? The question was so honest and so undefended that it stopped him for a second. A child asking not as a challenge, but as a genuine inquiry. Because in her experience, help had always had a cost attached, and she was trying to find the cost before she agreed to accept the help. He crouched down so he was at her level, and he looked at her directly. Because you're 7 years old, and it's 20 below outside, and your feet are hurt. And that's reason enough, he said. That's the whole reason. No other reason. She stared at him. Papa used to say that most things that look simple are complicated, and most things that look complicated are simple. Your papa sounds like he was a smart man. He was. Her voice didn't waver this time. It was steadier than it had been before. Not because the grief was smaller, but because she'd decided, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, to hold it differently. Like a thing she was carrying, rather than a thing that was carrying her. I'll walk, she said. But if it gets too bad, I'll tell you. That's fair. She stood up with the careful deliberateness of someone testing each step before committing to it. And when her wrapped feet hit the stable floor, she pulled in a sharp breath through her nose and went still for 3 seconds, and then let it out slow. The hurt was there. She was deciding not to let it stop her. They went out into the blizzard in a tight group. Dorothy on Norah's left, Caleb on her right, Margaret walking ahead to break the wind. The cold hit all of them with the same indifference it hit everything. No consideration for age or size or what anyone had been through that day. Norah walked without complaint, her head down against the wind, the dead man's coat wrapped tight around her, moving through the snow with a grim, deliberate concentration that made Caleb think of soldiers again, and then made him stop thinking of soldiers because she was a child, and she shouldn't have to know how to walk like that. The hotel was called the Salvation House, which struck Caleb as either optimistic or ironic, depending on your experience of the territory. The man behind the desk was young, nervous, with the eyes of someone who'd been given instructions and wasn't sure how to follow them if the situation got complicated. He looked at Caleb, looked at Norah, looked at Dorothy and Margaret, and his face went through several calculations very fast. "We're full," he said. "You've got 4 rooms with no light in the windows," Caleb said. "They're reserved." "For who?" The young man's eyes slid sideways for just a moment, toward the door at the back of the lobby, the one that led to the owner's office. And that sideways glance told Caleb everything about who'd given him his instructions and when. Caleb put both hands flat on the desk, and leaned forward and kept his voice completely level. "Son, I need 2 rooms. I'm going to pay for them in cash, right now. And we're both going to behave like the alternative to giving me those rooms isn't worth thinking about. Because it isn't." The young man swallowed. "Sir, Mr. Greer has—" "I'm not asking about Mr. Greer. I'm asking about 2 rooms. Cash. Tonight." Another swallow. A glance at Norah, who was standing just behind Caleb's left shoulder, with her chin up and her feet hurting, and her face showing none of it. And whatever the desk clerk saw in that small, frozen face moved something in him, because he reached under the counter and put 2 keys on the desk without another word. Caleb paid him and took the keys and turned back to the group. Margaret was watching him with that recalibrating look she'd been giving him since the general store. Dorothy had her hand on Norah's shoulder, light, not gripping, the touch of someone offering presence rather than control. "I'll take the room across the hall from you," Dorothy said, "in case she needs something in the night." "Appreciate it." Margaret stepped forward and crouched down to Norah's level, and for a woman who'd been holding herself at careful distance all evening, the directness of what she did next seemed to cost her something. She reached out and tucked the collar of the dead man's coat up around Norah's chin, a gesture so maternal and so unplanned that it seemed to surprise Margaret herself. She pulled her hands back quickly. "You'll eat breakfast at my store tomorrow morning," she said, brisk, like she was discussing inventory. "I open at 7. Don't be late." Norah looked up at her. "You're not going to try to make me go somewhere?" "Not tonight," Margaret said. "Tonight, you sleep." She stood up, straightened her coat, looked at Caleb with an expression that was as close to an alliance as someone like Margaret Coldwell probably got on short acquaintance. "Tomorrow is a different problem." She left. Caleb got Norah upstairs, Dorothy trailing behind. The room was small and cold and had a wood stove in the corner that hadn't been lit yet. Caleb got a fire going, while Dorothy helped Norah out of the dead man's coat and into the bed, which had 2 quilts on it and was warm enough once the stove got started that the cold became manageable. Norah sat in the bed with the quilts pulled up to her chin and looked around the room with a specific expression of someone who'd been sleeping in a horse stall for 2 nights and was recalibrating what counted as luxury. "It's warm," she said. "It'll get warmer," Caleb said from the stove. "There's a real pillow." "There is." She was quiet for a moment, running her hand across the surface of the pillow like she was checking that it was real. "The last bed I slept in was Papa's," she said. I slept in it for 3 nights after he died because it still smelled like him." She looked at the wall. "Then Mr. Greer's men came, and I had to go." Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed, not asking permission, just sitting there, the way you sit beside someone when they're saying something true and sad, and the only thing that helps is proximity. "I'm sorry, Norah." "Everybody's sorry," Norah said, and then she looked at Dorothy, and her voice softened. "But some people mean it, and some people are just saying words. And you mean it. So thank you." "How do you tell the difference?" Dorothy asked. "Eyes," Norah said simply. "People who mean it look scared when they say it, like the sorry cost them something. People who are just saying words look relieved when they finish saying it, like they paid a bill and now they're done." Dorothy looked over at Caleb, and something passed between them over the child's head. Not sentiment, but the particular weight of being seen clearly by a 7-year-old who had no reason to be that perceptive, and every reason to be. "Get some sleep," Caleb said to Norah. "You're safe tonight." She looked at him from the pillow. "Are you going to stay?" "I'll be in the hall." "That's not the same as staying." He pulled the chair from the corner and set it just inside the door. "I'll be right here." She watched him settle into the chair, watched him pull his coat around his shoulders and push his hat low, the way a man settled in for a long sit. The stove was starting to push warmth into the corners of the room, and the snow against the window was a steady, constant sound that was almost peaceful once you weren't in it anymore. "Mr. Holt," she said. "Caleb." A pause. "Caleb, Papa kept his promises, even the hard ones. He used to say, 'A man's word is the only thing nobody can take from him.'" Another pause, longer. "He broke that rule at the end. The drinking took it. But he tried for a long time to keep it." She closed her eyes. "I'm just telling you, so you know that I used to believe it was true, that promises meant something." Caleb sat in the chair with the firelight moving on the wall and the blizzard working at the windows, and thought about every promise he'd made in his life that he'd broken, and every order he'd followed that he shouldn't have, and the long road that led from a man he used to be to a chair in a hotel room in a Wyoming blizzard, watching a stranger's child finally let herself sleep. "Get some rest," he said quietly. Her breathing slowed, deepened. The particular change in rhythm that meant real sleep was taking over, the body finally releasing what the mind had been holding tense for days. Dorothy stood up carefully and crossed to the door, pausing beside Caleb's chair. "What are you going to do tomorrow?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Talk to the sheriff," he said. "I told you, McAllister won't—" "I know what you told me. I'm going to talk to him anyway." He kept his eyes on Norah. Sometimes a man needs to hear out loud what he already knows. Sometimes that's what it takes to move him. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. "And if it doesn't move him? Then I'll find another way." "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." She was quiet for a breath, and then she said, very quietly, "She hasn't asked about her father's grave." "No." "She will." "I know." He shifted in the chair. "When she does, I'll take her." Dorothy crossed to the door, stepped out into the hall, paused with her hand on the frame. "Mr. Holt. Caleb." He looked up. "Whatever brought you to Salvation Creek," she said carefully. "I'm glad the road came this way." He didn't answer that, not because he disagreed, but because some things were still too new to put words to. And he was a man who'd learned the hard way that naming something before it was solid had a way of breaking it. He turned back to the room, to the fire, to the small shape in the bed under 2 quilts and a dead man's protection. The wind against the windows rose and fell and rose again. The stove ticked and settled. Somewhere below them, the hotel groaned against the storm. And Norah Bell Hayes slept, for the first time in 3 weeks, in a room where someone had decided to stay. Caleb was awake before the light came. He'd slept maybe 2 hours in the chair, which was 2 more than he'd expected. Norah hadn't moved. She was still in the same position she'd fallen asleep in, on her side, facing the wall, the quilts pulled up to her ear, one hand tucked under the pillow, the way children slept when they felt safe enough to stop guarding themselves. He watched her breathe for a moment, and then stood up carefully, working the stiffness out of his bad hand, and went to check the stove. The fire had burned down to coals. He built it back up, quiet, methodical. The way you did things when someone was sleeping, and the sleep was hard-earned, and you understood the cost of waking them. When the stove was going again, he sat on the edge of the chair and looked at his hands in the early light, and thought about what the day required. The blizzard had eased some time before dawn. He could tell by the quality of the silence, not the pressed-down, straining silence of a storm working at the walls, but the open, cold, still silence of a world that had been remade overnight and was waiting to see what people were going to do about it. What he was going to do about it started with Wade McAllister. He heard Norah stir behind him, the small sounds of a child coming up from deep sleep, a breath, a shift, the rustle of quilts, then stillness, and he could feel the moment she remembered where she was. The moment, the instinct to be on guard, ran up against the fact that the room was warm, and the person in the chair was the same one who'd been there when she closed her eyes. "Morning," she said. "Morning." She sat up and pushed the hair out of her face and looked at the window where the gray early light was coming through. The frost on the glass had made patterns, elaborate and cold, like something had been drawing there in the night. She looked at it for a moment without speaking, and then she said, "Papa used to say frost patterns meant angels had been writing messages, but they wrote in a language people forgot how to read." Caleb looked at the frost. "What do you think?" "I think it's ice crystals forming along the glass grain." She paused. "But I like his version better." He stood up and stretched and went to the door. "I'm going to find you breakfast, and then I've got something to do this morning. Dorothy will stay with you." Norah's eyes tracked to him fast. "What are you doing?" "Talking to the sheriff." Her face tightened. "Mrs. Coldwell said he works for Greer." "She said he's in a hard position. That's different." He picked up his hat from the floor beside the chair and put it on. "A man who's in a hard position can still be moved. A man who works for Greer can't. I need to know which one McAllister is." "And if he's the wrong kind?" "Then I'll know that too, and I'll work with what I know." He looked at her steadily. "I told you I'd figure it out. I meant it." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded, once, the small, decisive nod that he was coming to recognize as Norah's version of trust. Not full and open and given freely, but measured out in careful increments, each one a deliberate choice. "Okay," she said, "but eat something first. You didn't eat last night." He looked at her. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything." She said it without pride, just fact. "Papa said it was going to get me in trouble someday. I think it's gotten me out of more trouble than it's gotten me into." He got her breakfast from downstairs, and Dorothy was already in the hall when he came back up with biscuits and gravy and a pot of coffee that the hotel kitchen had produced without enthusiasm, but at least produced. They ate together, the three of them, in the small, warm room, and Norah ate with less of the desperate hoarding speed from the night before. Not relaxed. She might not get to relaxed for a long while yet, but less braced for the food to disappear. Small progress, the kind that mattered. When he left, Norah was sitting cross-legged on the bed, listening to Dorothy read to her from a primer she'd produced from her satchel, following the words on the page with her finger, her face wearing that intent concentration that looked like the whole world had narrowed down to the distance between her eyes and the letters. He felt something in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for yet. He went to find the sheriff. The sheriff's office was on the main road, between the saloon and the telegraph office, a squat building with iron bars on the window and a woodpile out front that someone had worked hard to stack. McAllister was inside when Caleb pushed the door open, sitting behind a desk that was covered in papers, with a coffee cup in one hand and the expression of a man who'd been awake for most of the night, thinking about something that wouldn't resolve. He was bigger than Caleb expected. Mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with gray in his dark beard and eyes that were the particular shade of tired that came not from lack of sleep, but from the sustained work of carrying something heavy for too long. He looked at Caleb the way men in his position looked at strangers. The automatic professional assessment, threat level, intent, where the hands were. "Sheriff McAllister," Caleb said. "That's right. You're the man that rode in last night." Not a question. Word moved fast in small towns, faster in a blizzard when there was nothing else to talk about. "Caleb Holt, former Pinkerton, if the description I got is right." Caleb shut the door behind him. "Former, long former." "Why'd you leave?" "Because they gave an order I couldn't follow. And when I said so, they made it easy for me to leave." He pulled the chair across from the desk and sat down without being invited. "I'm not here to talk about the Pinkertons. I'm here about Norah Hayes." McAllister set down his coffee cup. His face had gone careful, controlled, the face of a man bracing for a conversation he'd been expecting. "She's a territorial matter. The arrangements for orphan children in cases of mining accidents are handled through—" "She's 7 years old," Caleb said, "and the arrangement you're describing is child labor in a Tucker County mine shaft." He kept his voice level, not aggressive, just direct. "You know that." The silence that followed had a specific quality to it. Not the silence of a man thinking about whether something was true. The silence of a man who already knew it was true and was deciding what to do with that knowledge out loud, in front of a witness, for maybe the first time. "What I know and what I can prove are two different things," McAllister said. "How hard have you looked for proof?" McAllister's jaw tightened. "You've been in this town 12 hours, Holt. Don't come in here and tell me what I have and haven't done." "I'm not telling you what you've done. I'm asking what you're going to do." Caleb leaned forward, with his elbows on his knees, and looked at the sheriff directly. "Because right now, there's a 7-year-old girl with frostbitten feet in a hotel room 200 yards from where we're sitting. And Harrison Greer has men in this town whose job it is to find her. And I need to know if you're going to help me protect her, or if you're going to be a problem I have to work around." McAllister stood up from his desk and walked to the window and stood with his back to Caleb, looking out at the main road, where the snow was still deep and the town was still quiet in the early morning. His hands were at his sides, and they were not entirely still. "I've got a wife," he said. "2 daughters, 8 and 10. He was quiet for a moment. "The 8-year-old looks like her mother. Same way of tilting her head when she's thinking about something." He turned back around, and his face was not the carefully controlled face anymore. It was the face underneath it, older and more tired and more honest. "I know what's happening at that facility in Tucker County. I've known for 8 months. I've written 3 letters to the territorial governor's office and gotten back 2 form responses and 1 letter that said the situation was under review." His voice was flat, the flatness of a man who'd used up his outrage and was running on something grimmer. "Under review, while children are being worked in mine tunnels." "Then help me," Caleb said. "With what? What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Buy me time. 3 days, maybe 4, until the road to Cheyenne opens. Keep Greer's men from taking her legally under the territory's orphan statutes. Tell them she's under your protective custody, pending investigation if you have to." He paused. "You have that authority." McAllister came back to the desk and sat down slowly. "If I invoke protective custody on Greer's arrangement, he'll have his lawyer here within the hour. He'll go over my head to the county judge. Judge Pearson is not a man who rules against Harrison Greer." "Then we need something bigger than Judge Pearson." Caleb thought about what Margaret had said. "Judge Hereford in Cheyenne. You have a relationship with him?" Something shifted in McAllister's expression. "I testified in a land fraud case before him 6 years ago. He's a fair man." "Telegraph him, today, before the office gets busy, before Greer's lawyer starts making noise. Put in writing what you know about the Tucker County facility. Your name on an official communication to a territorial judge carries more weight than my word as a passing stranger." McAllister looked at him for a long time. "You're asking me to put my career on a telegraph wire." "I'm asking you to do the job you took an oath to do." Caleb said it without heat, without judgment, just the plain shape of it laid out on the desk between them. "I know that's harder than it sounds, when the man funding your office is the man you're moving against. I know what it costs. But that girl's father died in Greer's mine because Greer cut corners on the shaft supports, and 6 men paid for it with their lives. And now Greer wants to take the daughter of one of those men and put her to work in the same kind of shaft. He stopped. Let that sit. That's the thing you've been carrying for 8 months. Send the telegram. Put it down. The clock on the wall behind McAllister ticked through 10 seconds of silence. Then McAllister opened his desk drawer and pulled out a telegraph form and a pen. And he started writing without saying another word. And Caleb sat back in his chair and let him write. He was 2 blocks from the sheriff's office, heading back toward the hotel, when Greer's man found him. He heard the footsteps first. 2 sets, moving to intercept from the left, coming out of the gap between the hardware store and the feed merchant. He stopped walking and turned to face them before they were fully out of the gap, which took away the tactical advantage they'd been counting on. And he watched both men recalibrate when they realized he'd heard them coming. The first one was large, with a jaw like a fence post, and the eyes of someone who did what he was told and didn't spend much time questioning it. The second one was smaller and sharper and more dangerous for it, the kind of man who thought before he swung. They both stopped at a distance that said they weren't sure yet how the conversation was going to go. "Mr. Holt," the sharper one said. His name was Voss, Caleb would learn later. Right now, he was just a man with a careful voice and a coat that didn't quite hide the shape of the iron on his hip. "Mr. Greer would like a word." "Mr. Greer can find me at the hotel." "He prefers somewhere more private." "I'll bet he would." Caleb looked at Voss steadily and kept his hands loose at his sides. His right hand was the bad one, the stiff one, the one that wouldn't close fast in the cold. He was aware of it the way he was always aware of it in situations like this. Not with fear, just with information, accounting for what he had and what he didn't. "Tell Mr. Greer I'm not hard to find, and I'm not hard to talk to. But I don't go places because I'm told to. That's a habit I gave up." Voss took one step forward, not threatening yet, establishing. "The girl is a ward of the territory. You're interfering with a legal arrangement. The girl is a child whose father worked for Harrison Greer and died because of it. If there's a legal arrangement being interfered with, you're going to want to take that up with Sheriff McAllister, who, as of about 20 minutes ago, has an interest in the matter." Caleb watched Voss process that, watched the small calculation happening behind those careful eyes. "Now, I'm going back to the hotel. If Mr. Greer wants to talk to me there, the door's open." He walked between them, not through them, between them, the specific path that said he wasn't afraid, but he also wasn't looking for a fight in the snow at 7 in the morning. And he kept his pace even and his shoulders loose, and he did not look back. He heard them standing there. He heard the larger one say something under his breath, and Voss cut him off with 2 sharp words. Then he heard their footsteps going the other direction. He let out a slow breath and kept walking. Margaret was at the hotel when he got back, standing in the lobby with her coat still on and a covered basket over one arm and an expression that said she'd heard something and was deciding how to present it. "Greer called a meeting," she said before he could speak. "Business owners on the main road. An hour from now at the saloon. He's going to make the case that an outside agitator is interfering with territory welfare services and destabilizing community order." "Outside agitator," Caleb said. "That would be you." "How many of those business owners are going to side with him?" 3 will side with him because he owns their debt. 4 will stay quiet because they're afraid. Maybe 2 will hold their ground." She paused. "Dorothy will hold her ground. I'll hold mine." "That's 2 out of 10. That's 2 more than Greer is expecting." Margaret set the basket on the front desk without asking permission. "I brought the girl proper breakfast. Real breakfast, not hotel food." She looked at him with those assessing eyes. "You talked to McAllister?" "I did." "And?" He sent a telegram to Judge Hereford. Something moved in Margaret's face. Surprise, maybe. Something behind the surprise that was more complicated. Wade McAllister sent a telegram against Greer's operation? She said it slowly, like she was checking the shape of it. I've been waiting for that man to find his spine for the better part of a year. He found it, Caleb said. It cost him something to find it. Give him credit for the cost. Margaret looked at him. You sound like you know what that particular kind of courage feels like. I know what it feels like to wait too long, he said. So I try to recognize it when someone does it, before the waiting gets to be too much. She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded, once, and picked up her basket and headed for the stairs. Caleb followed. Upstairs, Norah was still on the bed with the primer, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was sitting with it closed in her lap, and Dorothy was beside her, and the conversation had clearly just reached something difficult, because the room had that specific quality of two people who'd arrived at a truth that didn't have a comfortable shape. Norah looked up when they came in. She looked at Caleb first. Always at Caleb first. And whatever she read in his face told her what she needed to know about the morning. Because some of the held tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. Miss Prentice told me about the meeting, Norah said. Greer's meeting? I know about it. He's going to tell people you're causing trouble. Yes. Are you scared? The question was direct and genuine, the same quality all of Norah's questions had. She asked them because she wanted the true answer, not because she wanted to be comforted. Caleb sat down in the chair he'd spent the night in and looked at her. No, he said, not the way you mean. Men like Greer cause trouble with words first, and they do it because words usually work. If words don't work, then they go further. We're at the word stage, and I'm not afraid of words. Norah was quiet for a moment, turning the primer over in her hands. Papa used to say men with money fight dirty when they're losing. Said to watch out for when they stop talking and start doing things quiet. She looked up at him. He said that's the most dangerous time, the quiet time. Caleb looked at her. This child who should not have known the things she knew, who'd been taught them by a life that hadn't offered the luxury of ignorance. And he thought again about the mine shafts in Tucker County, about 6 dead men and 1 dead promise, and a small girl with dark eyes who'd learned to survive by paying attention to everything. Your papa was right, he said. That's why I want you to stay in this room today. Both doors locked. Don't open them for anyone except me, Dorothy, or Mrs. Coldwell. Norah looked at the locked door, then back at him. You're going to the meeting. I'm going to the meeting. You're one man. I've been one man my whole life. Haven't stopped me yet. The ghost of that almost smile crossed her mouth. There and gone. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. I know. He stood up. But it's true, and true beats reassuring most days. He looked at Dorothy and Margaret, who were both watching him, with the expressions of women who had already decided to be in it, regardless of the odds, and were waiting to see if he was the same kind. You two ready? I've been ready for 8 months, Margaret said, and set her basket down on the bed for Norah, with a firmness that meant the subject was closed. Eat your breakfast. Norah looked in the basket. Real biscuits, wrapped in cloth, still warm. A jar of honey. Dried apples. She looked up at Margaret with an expression that was trying very hard not to show how much the gesture meant, because Norah Hayes had learned that showing people what mattered to you gave them something to use against you. Margaret turned away before the girl could thank her, which was either efficiency or kindness. With Margaret, it was usually both. Caleb picked up his hat. Norah's voice stopped him at the door. Caleb. He turned. She was holding one of the biscuits in both hands, and looking at him with those serious, dark eyes. And what was in them was not fear, and not demand, and not the careful measuring calculation he'd come to know in the last 18 hours. It was something newer, something she was clearly not accustomed to carrying. "Come back," she said. 2 words. The same 2 words she'd been unable to say to her father for 3 weeks, because her father hadn't come back, and saying the words out loud had started to feel like a risk she couldn't afford. She was saying them now. He looked at her and felt the full weight of what that cost her, and what it meant that she'd spent it anyway. "I will," he said. He went out into the cold, white morning with Margaret Coldwell on his left and Dorothy Prentice on his right, and the telegraph message to Judge Hereford already on the wire, and the meeting at the saloon 40 minutes away. And he walked toward it the way he'd learned to walk toward the things he was afraid of. Not fast, not slow, just steady. 1 foot and then the other. Because the only way out was through, and he'd been done with going around for longer than he'd known it. The saloon was called the Winter's Edge, which Caleb thought was either the most honest name in Wyoming territory or the least imaginative. It held maybe 30 people on a good night. This morning it held 11, seated at the 3 largest tables pushed together in the center of the room. And every one of those 11 knew why they were there before Harrison Greer said a single word. Greer was already standing when Caleb walked in. He was not what Caleb had expected, which was the first useful piece of information. He'd built a picture of Greer in his head from what people had said. The debt he held over the town, the mine operations, the arrangements with Tucker County. And the picture had a certain shape to it, large and loud, the kind of man who used size to make his point. The actual Harrison Greer was medium height, carefully dressed, with the kind of stillness that came not from patience, but from the habit of control. Pale eyes, light hair going gray, hands that had never worked iron or rope and knew it. The eyes were the thing. They moved over Caleb when it came to the door the way you'd inventory a piece of equipment, assessing use, assessing cost, assessing whether the thing was worth the trouble it represented. "Mr. Holt," Greer said. His voice was pleasant, professionally pleasant, the way lawyers' voices were pleasant. "I'm glad you came. I was afraid this conversation would have to happen without you." "Hard to have a conversation about a man without him," Caleb said. He didn't go to a chair. He stood near the door, with Margaret on his left and Dorothy on his right, and looked at the room. He recognized 2 of the men at the table, from the general shape of their anxiety. They were the ones who owed Greer money, and they had the specific expression of people who'd been told what was expected of them, and were hoping the situation resolved before they had to prove they'd comply. The others he didn't know. Reverend Alcott was there, thin and careful, with his hands folded on the table and his eyes in the middle distance between his conscience and his circumstance. Greer gestured to the empty chairs. "Please, sit." "I'm fine standing." A small pause. Greer absorbed the refusal without showing it cost him anything, which meant he was practiced at this. "Then I'll be direct," he said. "You arrived in this town last night during a blizzard, which I understand and have no issue with. What I do have an issue with is that you've involved yourself in a territorial welfare matter that is outside your jurisdiction, your understanding, and your business." "A 7-year-old girl with frostbitten feet in a horse stall," Caleb said. "That's the welfare matter you're describing." "A child whose father died in a workplace accident, which is a tragedy, and for whom the territory has made lawful arrangements for care and placement." Greer's voice stayed pleasant. "You've removed her from those arrangements. That's interference with the legal process." "I've put her in a warm room with food and a doctor looking at her feet. If that's interference, the law needs to look at itself." One of the men at the table, The one with the hardware store, Caleb thought, from the Calluses, shifted in his chair. Not agreement, not yet, but movement, which was something. "Mr. Holt," Greer said, and now the pleasantness had a different quality under it. Thinner, like ice over water that was still moving. "I'm going to be very clear about what happens if this situation continues. You are a man passing through. You have no legal standing in this territory, no property, no residency, and no relationship to the child in question. What you have done is taken a ward of the territory from lawful custody. That is a crime. I am prepared to have you charged with it before noon today." Caleb looked at him. "Wade McAllister sent a telegraph to Judge Hereford in Cheyenne this morning," he said. "Official communication about the conditions at your Tucker County facility. That telegraph is already on the wire." The room changed. Not dramatically. Nobody stood up. Nobody shouted. But the quality of the air in it changed. The way air changes before weather arrives. A pressure shift that everyone in the room felt in their chest without knowing exactly what it was. Greer's pleasant expression stayed in place for 2 full seconds after Caleb finished speaking, which was how Caleb knew it was a trained expression and not a natural one, because a natural expression would have moved faster. Then it did move, and underneath it was something colder and more honest. "McAllister doesn't have the authority to—" "He has every authority," Caleb said. "He's the acting sheriff of this county, and he has direct knowledge of conditions at a territorial facility that may constitute criminal misuse of the orphan welfare statutes. That's not my word against yours. That's a sworn officer's official communication to a sitting territorial judge." He let that settle. "How long before the road to Cheyenne opens? 3 days? 4? Judge Hereford is going to want answers before he sends a response. You're going to want to have them ready." Greer looked at him for a long moment, the pale eyes doing their inventory again, reassessing, recalculating the cost of the equipment. "You know what I find interesting," he said, and his voice had dropped the pleasantness entirely now. Not angry, controlled anger, which was more dangerous. "Former Pinkerton men don't usually grow consciences. They usually grow other things. Ambition, deals, interest in situations that might be profitable to manage correctly." He tilted his head fractionally. "I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Holt. I'm also a practical one. There are ways this situation resolves that are good for everyone involved." The room was very quiet. Caleb felt Margaret go still beside him, felt Dorothy do the same. He understood what Greer had just offered, understood the precise shape of it. Not a bribe stated plainly, because men like Greer didn't state bribes plainly. An implication, a door left open, a suggestion that the world contained arrangements that could be made if the right people were practical about their interests. "I was a Pinkerton for 9 years, Caleb said. "And you're right that most men in that work don't develop consciences. I didn't develop one on schedule either. I developed it 8 months ago, when I followed an order I knew was wrong, and then spent the next 3 months understanding what that meant about who I'd been." He looked at Greer directly. "I'm not interested in arrangements. I'm not interested in being practical about my interests at the expense of a 7-year-old girl. And I'm not going to move." Greer turned away from him then, and when he turned back, he was looking at the room, at the 10 other people at the table, and his voice had taken on a different register. The public voice. The voice for witnesses. "I want everyone here to understand that what Mr. Holt has done creates a legal situation that affects this entire community. His interference with the territory's welfare arrangement means that child becomes a liability. Someone has to be legally responsible for her. Someone has to house her, feed her, educate her. The territory's arrangement exists because communities like ours cannot absorb that kind of open-ended obligation." He paused. I'm not the villain in this story. I'm the man trying to keep an orderly system working. The hardware store man spoke. His name was Birch, and his voice came out rough, like he'd been holding it in all morning. Where exactly do those children go, Greer? The Tucker County facility. What is it? Greer turned toward him. A supervised work program. Skills development. The children learn trades that will serve them as adults. At 8 years old? Children that age in frontier communities have always contributed to, "My girl is 8 years old," Birch said. He was not a large man, and he was not a brave man by nature. Caleb could see that clearly. But something in him had reached a point where the cost of silence had gotten higher than the cost of speaking. She doesn't work in mine shafts to develop skills. She goes to Miss Prentice's school, and she learns to read, and she comes home, and she sits at the table and does her sums. His voice was shaking slightly. That's what 8 years old looks like. What you're describing isn't a skills program. Mr. Birchall, your loan payment isn't due until March, but I know when my loan payment is due, Birchall said, and his voice stopped shaking. I know it real well. I think about it a lot. He pushed back his chair and stood up. I think I'm done with this meeting. He walked out. The door swung shut behind him. The room was very still. Then the feed merchant stood up without saying anything and walked out after him. Greer's jaw tightened for just a moment, and then he looked at Reverend Alcott, and whatever passed between them in that look had a history to it, long and layered. The history of a man who'd been asking another man to stay quiet, and a man who'd been complying, and both of them knowing the shape of what that cost. Alcott unfolded his hands from the table. He looked at them for a moment, like they belonged to someone else, and then he looked up at Greer. Harrison, he said, Tom Hayes died in your mine. His girl is 7 years old, and she's been sleeping in a horse stall for 2 nights. He paused. I've been praying about this situation for 3 weeks. I think I've been using prayer as an excuse not to act, and I think God is considerably tired of that particular arrangement. He stood up. I'm going to go see what I can do that's actually useful. He walked out. The room had 6 people left in it, and 2 of them were Greer's own men, and one of them was the hotel owner who'd already demonstrated his willingness to be bought. The other 3 were the debt holders, still in their chairs, still not moving, but changed now. Their faces had the look of men who'd seen something they couldn't unsee, and were trying to figure out what that obligated them to do. Greer looked at Caleb. The pleasant expression was entirely gone, and what was there instead was the actual man, stripped of the professional surface, and what was there was not weak. That was important to understand. Greer was not weak. He was a man who'd built something real from nothing and protected it with the tools available to him, and believed, with a kind of iron certainty, that the world operated on arrangements and leverage, and that anyone who claimed otherwise was either naive or lying. You've made an enemy today, Greer said. I've had enemies before, Caleb said. Not like me. Probably not exactly like you, Caleb agreed, but the same shape. Greer held his gaze for a long moment, and then picked up his hat from the table and walked out through the back, Voss and the larger man following. The 3 debt holders sat for another minute in the suddenly empty room, and then they left too, quietly, one by one, not making eye contact with anyone. Margaret let out a slow breath beside Caleb. Well, she said. Well, he agreed. Birchall surprised me. She sounded like she meant it. I didn't think he had it in him. Scared men can surprise you, Dorothy said from his right. Her voice was steady, but her hands, when she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, were not entirely still. When they finally stopped being scared of the right thing. They walked back to the hotel through the cold, and Caleb spent the walk doing math he didn't like. The telegraph to Hereford was sent. The meeting had gone better than expected, but Greer wasn't finished. A man like that didn't absorb a public loss and go home to sit quietly. He was already planning the next move, and the next move would be the quiet kind that Norah's father had warned about. The quiet kind was the dangerous kind. McAllister was waiting in the hotel lobby when they came in. He had his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who'd burned a bridge and was watching it go, and was still certain he'd made the right choice, and was finding that certainty was not the same as comfort. He looked at Caleb and said, "Hereford wired back already." Caleb stopped. That was fast. Hereford's been watching the Tucker County situation for 4 months. He was waiting for someone with standing to file a formal complaint. My telegraph gave him what he needed to act. McAllister paused. He's sending a territorial marshal. Should be here in 5 days if the road cooperates. Sooner if it opens faster than expected. Dorothy made a small sound, not a word. Just the sound of someone who'd been holding their breath for a long time and had just been given permission to let it go. 5 days, Margaret said. Greer has 5 days to make this difficult. He's already making it difficult, McAllister said. Voss came to my office 20 minutes ago with a writ from Judge Pearson. Temporary injunction. Claims I acted outside my authority in sending the telegraph, and orders the child returned to territorial custody pending a hearing. He held up the document, folded, and then set it on the front desk. I told Voss the writ would receive my full attention at the appropriate time. Appropriate time meaning whenever Hereford's marshal gets here and we see what a territorial judge with actual jurisdiction has to say about Judge Pearson's writ. Caleb looked at him. You're holding the line. I'm doing my job. McAllister said it with a flatness that was not modesty, but something more complicated. A man reclaiming a thing he'd let go and finding it heavier than he remembered. I should have done it 8 months ago. I didn't. I'm doing it now, and I'd appreciate it if we didn't spend a lot of time discussing the gap. Fair enough. McAllister put his hat back on. Keep the girl inside. Keep her quiet. Greer's men will be watching the hotel, and they'll be watching the roads out of town in case you try to move her. Don't try to move her. The moment you're on a road with her, Pearson's writ gives them legal basis to take her, and there isn't a thing I can do about it on the open range. He looked at Caleb. You understand what I'm telling you. We wait. You wait. He turned to go and then stopped without turning back. Holt, what you said in my office this morning about the thing I've been carrying. A pause. You were right about the weight of it. I didn't know it would feel lighter until it did. He walked out. Caleb went upstairs. Norah was at the window when he came in, standing on the chair so she could see down into the main road, watching the town with the intent surveillance of a child who'd learned that paying attention was a form of survival. She heard him come in and turned around and looked at him and did that rapid reading of his face that she always did. The thing she'd told him she'd learned from watching her father for signs of what kind of day it was going to be. You came back, she said. Present tense. Not surprised. A fact being confirmed, carefully, like she was adding it to a list she was keeping. Said I would. What happened at the meeting? He sat down and told her. Not all of it. Not the part where Greer had implied a bribe, because that was a kind of ugliness a 7-year-old didn't need the specific shape of. But the parts that mattered. Birchall standing up. Alcott walking out. McAllister holding the writ. The marshal coming in 5 days. She listened without interrupting. That was one of the things about Norah. She listened to the whole thing before she responded. The way people listened when they understood that the full information mattered, and that interrupting was how you missed the parts that changed the meaning. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 5 days is a long time. It is. Greer's going to do something before then. Probably. What are you going to do about it? Watch for it. Try to be ready. He looked at her. And not let you out of my sight. She processed that, turned the wolf's tooth charm in her fingers, the one that had been on a cord around her neck since he'd first found her. He'd noticed her do it before, when she was thinking through something difficult, and he'd learned not to interrupt it. My papa used to say the worst thing about waiting, she said, was that it felt the same whether the thing was coming or not. You just had to sit with not knowing. She looked at the charm in her hand. He was better at waiting than me. I got the bad end of that. Waiting's hard, Caleb said. Doesn't mean you're bad at it. Means you're honest about how it feels. She looked up at him. Are you bad at it too? Terrible at it, he said. Always have been. The ghost of a smile again, closer to the surface than it had been yesterday. We're the same kind then. Seems like. She put the charm back against her chest and looked at the window and the light coming through the frost patterns. And Caleb looked at her, this small, fierce child who'd survived 3 weeks alone in a Wyoming winter and still had the capacity to make an almost smile at the right moment. And he felt the unnamed thing in his chest that he'd been avoiding naming settle into something more definite. He wasn't leaving Salvation Creek without her. He hadn't been, not since the stable. But he'd been telling himself it was circumstance. It was obligation. It was one step at a time, and don't look too far ahead. Sitting in this room, watching her look out at the town that had left her to freeze and was now being asked to account for that, he stopped telling himself those things. He was not leaving without her. What that meant, what it required, what it was going to cost, those were questions for after the 5 days were up, and the marshal arrived, and the law sorted itself out. Right now, it was just the fact of it, solid and immovable, the way the important facts always were. Dorothy came in with dinner an hour later, and Margaret came with her, carrying a pot of proper stew that she'd made in her store kitchen and brought over, wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. And the 4 of them ate together in the small, warm room, while the temperature outside dropped, and the remaining snow tightened on the ground, and somewhere in Salvation Creek, Harrison Greer sat in his house, making the quiet plans that were the dangerous ones. Norah ate her whole bowl without watching the door once. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything. He just filed it away in the place where he kept the things that mattered. Another degree of distance between the girl she'd been 2 nights ago in a horse stall and the girl she was becoming. One careful increment at a time, in a room where someone had decided to stay. He was still awake when the sound came, just past midnight, from the alley below the window. Not loud, not dramatic, just the sound of boots in packed snow moving with the specific, deliberate quiet of someone who didn't want to be heard. He was out of the chair and at the window before the sound finished registering, and what he saw in the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow made every nerve in his body go to attention at once. 3 men, coming from the alley toward the hotel's side entrance. Not Voss and the large man from the morning. Different men, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that said they'd done this kind of work before and had been told exactly how to do it tonight. Greer's quiet move, right on schedule. Caleb turned from the window and looked at Norah, who was already awake, already sitting up, already watching him with those dark eyes that never missed anything. And he understood in that moment that she'd been awake for a while, that she'd heard the sounds before he had, and had been lying still, waiting to see if he heard them too. You heard, he said. Yes. She was already moving, pulling on her boots with the quick, economical movements of someone who'd learned to be ready fast. Stay close to me, Caleb said. Whatever happens, don't let go of my hand. She stood up from the bed and crossed to him and put her hand in his, cold fingers and strong grip, and looked up at him with an expression that was not fear and not bravado, but something more honest than either. The clear-eyed readiness of a child who had already survived the worst things she could imagine and had decided that whatever came next, she was going to face it standing up. "I'm not letting go," she said. He believed her. He moved them into the hall first. Not running. Running made noise, and noise was the thing they couldn't afford right now. He kept Nora's hand in his, and they went out the door fast and quiet, and he knocked on Dorothy's door twice, the pattern they'd agreed on, and heard her moving on the other side before his knuckles finished the second rap. She opened it, already dressed, already holding her coat, with the expression of a woman who'd been sleeping light and waiting for exactly this. She took one look at Caleb's face and didn't ask any questions. She reached back into her room for the satchel and pulled the door shut behind her. "Side entrance," Caleb said, low. "3 men. Moving now." "There's a back stair," Dorothy said, "at the end of the hall. Comes out through the kitchen." He hadn't known that. He looked at her, and she met his eyes and gave him a small nod that said she'd been thinking about exit routes since the moment they'd checked in. Because Dorothy Prentice was the kind of woman who thought about those things in situations like this, and he was grateful for it. They went down the back stair in single file. Caleb first, Norah behind him, still holding his hand, Dorothy last. The kitchen was dark and cold and smelled like old grease and wood smoke, and they went through it without touching anything. And Caleb eased the back door open an inch and looked out. Clear. The alley behind the hotel ran between the building and the feed merchant's back wall, and it was empty and white and silent under a sky that had gone clear after the blizzard. Stars hard and cold and very far away. He opened the door and they went out. "Margaret," he said, keeping his voice below the wind. "She's 3 streets over," Dorothy whispered. "Her store has a back room. She told me this morning, if things got complicated, they're complicated." They moved down the alley, with their breath-making clouds in the freezing air, and Caleb kept his eyes on every angle, and his hand around Norah's, and his mind on the 3 men who were almost certainly inside the hotel now, going up the front stairs, heading for a room that was going to be empty when they got there. And he gave them maybe 4 minutes before they came back out and started looking. Norah matched his pace without being told to. She'd pulled the dead man's coat tight around herself, and she was moving with that same grim, deliberate focus he'd seen on the walk from the stable. Head down, feet working despite whatever they still felt like in the cold. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Margaret's store was dark from the front and lit from the back. A thin line of light under the storage room door, visible from the alley. Caleb knocked once. The door opened before he'd finished the knock, and Margaret stood there with a lantern held low, already dressed, already awake, with the look of a woman who'd made her decision hours ago and was simply waiting for the situation to catch up to it. She looked at the 3 of them in the alley, and then looked past them to check the street, and then pulled them inside and shut the door and put her back against it. "I heard them go by 20 minutes ago," she said. "Greer's men, heading for the hotel." She looked at Caleb. "I was coming to warn you." "We got out," he said. "I see that." She looked at Norah. The girl was standing in the middle of the storage room with her chin up and her eyes clear, and her hand still in Caleb's. And Margaret looked at her the way she'd been looking at her since the beginning. Like something was moving in her that she'd decided a long time ago to keep behind a locked door. And the lock was giving way, whether she wanted it to or not. "Sit down," Margaret said to Norah, gruff, practical, the same voice she used for everything. She pulled the blanket off the cot in the corner and put it around the girl's shoulders. "Your feet." "They're all right," Norah said. "You've been standing in the cold in the middle of the night. They are not all right." Margaret crouched down and unwrapped the bandaging Dorothy had done and checked the toes with careful hands, and her face stayed neutral, but her hands were gentle. the specific gentleness of someone who was handling something they understood to be precious and were trying not to show how much they understood it. "Better," Dorothy said from over Margaret's shoulder. "The color's better than last night." "They'll hold," Margaret said. She rewrapped them briskly and stood up and looked at Caleb. "What now?" "Now we wait for daylight, and we go to McAllister before Greer does." "Greer will go at first light." "Then we go before first light." Margaret looked at the clock on the wall above the storeroom shelf. 1:20 in the morning. 3 hours, maybe less, before the sky started going gray. "There's a cot," Margaret said to Norah. "Try to sleep." "I won't sleep," Norah said. "I know you won't. Try anyway." Something in the way Margaret said it. Not gentle exactly, but with a particular certainty. The voice of a woman who'd said those words to a child before in the dark, and meant them with everything she had, made Norah stop arguing. She sat on the cot and pulled the blanket around herself, and leaned back against the wall. And her eyes stayed open, but she stopped bracing, and that was as close to rest as any of them were going to get. Caleb sat on the floor with his back against the storage shelves, and Dorothy sat in the room's one chair, and Margaret stood by the door. And for 2 hours they kept their own company and their own thoughts, and the only sound was the wind off the mountains working at the eaves of the building, and the small, steady sound of Norah's breathing. Sometime after 3, she fell asleep between one breath and the next, between one moment and the next, the way exhaustion finally took over when the body had nothing left to run on. Her head tipped sideways against the wall, and her hand went slack around the wolf's tooth charm, and her face went young, really young, the age it actually was. All the guardedness dropping away in sleep, the way it always did with children. Margaret looked at her for a long moment from the door. Then she looked away, and Caleb could see the line of her jaw working, and he didn't say anything, because Margaret Coldwell had a right to her grief in private, and it wasn't his place to name it out loud. Dorothy caught his eye from the chair and gave a small nod that said she saw it too, and understood it in the way people understand things that echo their own experience. She'd been gentle with Margaret all evening, in ways so unobtrusive that Margaret probably hadn't noticed. And that was a particular kind of competence that Caleb recognized and respected. He was thinking about what competence looked like, what it felt like from the inside when you were doing it right versus doing it because the world required it of you. When the sound came from the front of the store, not the side entrance, not the back door, the front. Boot heels on the porch boards, then a fist on the door, 3 hard knocks, not a question, a demand. Margaret was at the front of the store before the 3rd knot finished. She put her hand on the door handle and looked back at Caleb, and he crossed to the storage room door and pulled it mostly shut, leaving an inch gap. And he stood in that gap and watched. "Who's there?" Margaret called through the door, not scared, not pretending not to know, just asking. "Wade McAllister." A pause. "Open up, Mag. I know they're here." Margaret opened the door. McAllister came in alone, which was the first reassurance. And he came in with his hat already off, which was the second. And his face had the look of a man who'd been awake all night doing something difficult, and was coming to report on it. He looked around the store, and then at the partially closed storage room door, and he said, "Is she all right?" "She's sleeping," Margaret said. Something released in McAllister's face. "Good." He came to the counter and put both hands flat on it. "Greer's men went to the hotel at 10 past midnight. I was watching. I saw them go in, and I waited to see if you'd come out. And when you didn't come out the front, I went around the back and found the tracks." He looked at Caleb in the doorway. "You moved fast." "Had good help." McAllister nodded. "I pulled Voss in about 30 minutes ago, disturbing the peace, which is thin, but it gave me something to hold him on until morning. The other 2 left town heading south. which either means they spooked or Greer sent them for something I don't know about yet. He paused. I've got a man watching Greer's house. If he moves in the night, I'll know. And Pearson's writ, Caleb said. Pearson's writ requires me to return the child to territorial custody. It does not specify the hour or the method. I am choosing to interpret my compliance window as beginning at the moment the road to Cheyenne is physically passable. McAllister met his eyes. The road crew's assessment this morning was 2 days minimum. Hereford's marshal. I wired again at midnight. Asked him to send by horseback if the stage road was still closed. Hereford wired back 20 minutes later. McAllister reached into his coat and produced the telegram. Unfolded it on the counter. He's sending 2 marshals on horseback at first light. Best time estimate is 36 hours. 36 hours. The number sat in the room, and everyone felt the shape of it. Big enough to hold a lot of trouble. Small enough to hold on to. What about Greer himself? Dorothy asked from the chair. Greer won't move directly, McAllister said. He's too careful for that. What he'll do is work through Pearson's writ and through the territorial statutes, and he'll do it in a courtroom, and he'll do it with a lawyer who knows how to make a kidnapping charge out of a man protecting a child from a labor operation. He looked at Caleb. The charge is real, Holt. If you had taken her out of town, out of the territory, he'd have the basis for it. As long as you're here, and she's here, and we're all operating within the county, I can hold the line. But if you run, you hand him everything he needs. I'm not running, Caleb said. You sure? Because the easy thing is to move her south tonight and get her past the county line before anyone can. I'm not running, Caleb said again. And the way he said it closed the question. I ran from things for 3 years, and I'm done with the education. We hold here. McAllister looked at him for a long moment, and then something in his expression settled, the way a thing settles when it finds the right level. Then I'll be at the office at first light. Bring her there at 8 o'clock. I want her in my custody officially, by the book, with witnesses, so that when Greer's lawyer shows up with the writ, there's a record of exactly what's happening and why. He turned to leave, and then paused, the way men paused in this story when they'd said the practical thing, and the other thing was waiting to be said. He turned back, and he looked at the storage room door, at the inch of gap through which he could see the edge of the cot and the small shape on it. And his voice when he spoke next was different. Not the sheriff's voice, not the official voice, but the voice of a man with 2 daughters, aged 8 and 10, one of whom had her mother's way of tilting her head. She's got a mouth on her, McAllister said. The Hayes girl. I saw her once, in August, outside the mine when the men were coming off shift. She was waiting for her father. He came out covered in dust, and she walked straight up to him and told him his boots were untied, like she'd been keeping track of it all day, and was very glad to finally deliver the information. Nobody spoke. He laughed, McAllister said. Biggest laugh I'd heard in a long time. He put his hat back on. I should have done more after he died. I knew about the girl. I knew. He opened the door, and the cold came in. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. He went out into the dark. They came to the sheriff's office at 8 o'clock, with the morning sky going pale, and the cold so absolute it hurt to breathe through the nose. Margaret walked on Norah's left. Dorothy walked on her right. Caleb walked ahead, which was not strategy, but instinct. The instinct of someone placing himself between a child and whatever the morning was bringing down the road. Greer was already there. He was standing on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office with his lawyer, a narrow man named Croft, who carried a leather case and had the eyes of someone who'd built a career on making the worse argument sound like the better one. They watched Caleb's group come up the road, and Greer's face was doing the inventory again, calm and pale and assessing. Norah saw him before anyone said anything. She knew who he was. She'd described him to Caleb the night before in the storage room. Matter of fact, the way she described everything. Medium height, light hair, always dressed like he'd just come from somewhere important. She recognized him, and she didn't stop walking. She matched Caleb's pace, step for step, her wrapped feet in her boots on the packed snow, her chin level, her eyes steady. Greer looked at her. She looked back at him. "Mr. Holt," Greer said, "I'd hoped you'd come to your senses overnight." "I came to the sheriff's office," Caleb said. "Seems like senses to me." Croft stepped forward with his leather case. "My client has a writ from Judge Pearson, signed this morning, requiring the immediate return of the minor child Norah Bell Hayes to territorial custody. Sheriff McAllister is legally obligated to— I'm legally obligated to do a number of things," McAllister said from the doorway. He'd come out without anyone noticing. Quiet for a big man. And he stood in the doorframe with his arms crossed and his badge catching the pale morning light. "I'm also in receipt of a direct communication from Territorial Judge Erasmus Hereford, indicating his intention to review all arrangements pertaining to the Tucker County Welfare Facility, effective immediately, pending the arrival of his authorized representatives." He looked at Croft. "Judge Hereford outranks Judge Pearson. That's not my opinion. That's the structure of the territorial judiciary." Croft's face went careful. "That communication has not been formally filed." "It's on the wire, witnessed and time-stamped." McAllister looked at Greer. "Harrison, I've known you for 12 years. I've eaten at your table. I know you built this operation from nothing. And I know you believe you run it right." His voice was steady, not unkind, but without any give in it. "What's happening at Tucker County is not right. You know it isn't, and I know it isn't, and the only thing that's been holding that truth in place is the distance between here and Cheyenne, and the money you've put into making sure the right people look the other way." He paused. "I'm done being one of those people." The street was not empty. It had been filling since they'd come around the corner. Birchell from the hardware store, and the feed merchant, and two other faces Caleb didn't know, standing at the edges of the boardwalk in the cold morning, watching. Not a crowd, just people. Neighbors. The kind of witnesses whose presence meant something, even when they didn't speak. Greer looked at the people on the boardwalk. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Norah. She was standing in the snow between Margaret and Dorothy, looking up at him with the expression she used on everyone until she'd decided what they were. That patient, measuring, entirely unfrightened look that had no business being in a 7-year-old's face and was there anyway because life had put it there. "My father worked for you," she said. Her voice was clear in the cold air. Not loud. Clear. The specific clarity of someone who'd thought about what they were going to say and wasn't going to waste a word of it. "He died in your mine," she said. "In a tunnel that the other miners told me had bad supports for 6 months before it came down. I heard them talking at the funeral. They thought I wasn't listening." She paused. "I was always listening." She held the wolf's tooth charm at her chest, one hand flat against it. "You came to my house 4 days after he was buried and told me I had to go to a home where children work in mine shafts. You said it was for my benefit." Her dark eyes stayed on Greer's face without blinking. "My papa taught me that people who do wrong things don't usually know they're wrong. They usually have a reason that makes sense to them. I've been trying to understand your reason." Another pause, shorter. "I can't find one that's good enough." The street was very quiet. Greer looked at this 7-year-old girl who had just said the clearest thing anyone had said to him in 12 years of building an empire. And for the first time since Caleb had seen his face, the pale eyes moved. Not the trained assessment, not the inventory, but something underneath that, something human and uncomfortable and raw. The look of a man hearing a true thing from a place he hadn't expected it to come from, and having no professional surface available to put over it fast enough. He didn't answer her. He looked at his lawyer. He looked at McAllister. He looked at the people on the boardwalk, and then he looked at Norah one more time. And whatever he saw in her face, that ancient patience, that absolute refusal to be less than fully present in the moment, that specific courage of a child who had survived everything and was still standing in the snow looking you in the eye, whatever he saw in it did something to him that Caleb could not name and did not try to. "Croft," Greer said. His voice came out differently than it had all morning. Quieter. "Walk with me." He turned and walked back down the boardwalk, and his lawyer followed, and they got to the end of the street and stopped and talked in low voices for 2 minutes. And then Croft walked back alone and stood in front of McAllister and said, in the flat voice of a man delivering news he'd been told to deliver, "My client is withdrawing the Pearson writ, pending the review by Judge Hereford's office." He paused. "He requests that the situation be handled through proper legal channels going forward." McAllister looked at him. "Tell him it will be." Croft walked away. The boardwalk people exhaled, one by one, the slow release of tension that had been building since the morning started. Birch put his hat back on and went back toward his store, and the feed merchant did the same, and the small knot of watchers dissolved back into the ordinary business of a December morning in Salvation Creek. Norah turned to Caleb. She still had her hand against the wolf's tooth charm, and she looked up at him, and she didn't say anything for a moment, just looked. And he looked back. And in that silence were all the things that had happened in the last 3 days. The stable, the hotel, the long, cold night in Margaret's storage room, the meetings and the telegrams and the 3 men at the side entrance, and the 36 hours of holding the line. And all of it was present in the air between them, and none of it needed to be said out loud. "It's not over," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "Hereford's people will come, and there'll be hearings, and Greer will fight what he can fight through the courts, and that'll take time." He crouched down to her level in the snow. "But you're not going to Tucker County. That part is over." She nodded, turned the charm over in her fingers. "Where do I go?" He'd been waiting for this question since the stable. He'd been waiting for it and not answering it even in his own head, because there was a version of the answer that was the safe version, the practical version, the version where he found the right people and made the right arrangements and continued down the road he'd been on. And there was the other version, the one that had been true since the moment he'd sat down in the hay of that stall and decided to stay at her level until she was ready. "With me," he said, "if you want." She looked at him. "Where are you going?" "I don't know yet." He held her gaze. "But I'm not going anywhere without knowing you're somewhere safe. And the safest place I can think of is wherever I am." He paused. "That's not much of a promise. I know it isn't. I'm a man with a bad hand and a lame horse and no fixed address and more history than I've told you. But I stopped in front of that stable 3 nights ago, and I'm not built for moving past things anymore." Dorothy was crying quietly behind him. He could hear it. Margaret was not crying, but she had the look of a woman pressing down on something very hard. Norah looked at him for a long time with those dark eyes doing their measuring work, going over every line of his face, the way she'd been doing since the first night, checking for the place where the words and the truth came apart. She didn't find it. "Okay," she said. One word, simple as breathing. The same word she'd been using her whole life to accept the world's arrangements, most of which had been bad ones. And she said it now with the same plainness she used for everything, which was how he knew she meant it completely. Because Norah Hayes didn't dress things up. She said what was true, and she said it straight, and she let it stand. "Okay," she said again, and took his hand. He stood up with her hand in his, and they turned to face whatever the rest of the morning was bringing. And Margaret was already moving ahead to clear the way Margaret always moved. And Dorothy was wiping her eyes with the practical briskness of a woman who cried honestly and recovered fast. And McAllister was back in the doorway of the sheriff's office, watching them go, with the expression of a man who'd found his spine and was learning how it felt to stand straight in it. The legal proceedings took 4 months. Hereford's marshals arrived in 31 hours, faster than estimated, because one of them had a personal acquaintance with Tom Hayes from 10 years back. And when he got the telegram, he rode through the night. The Tucker County facility was shut down by territorial order in February. 6 men, including 2 Greer employees, were charged with violations of the child welfare statutes. Greer himself was not charged. His lawyers were too good, and his distance from the direct operations too carefully constructed. But the mine was placed under investigation, and the business arrangements that had funded half of Salvation Creek's debt were renegotiated at terms that no longer required the town to look the other way about anything. Judge Pearson retired in March, which surprised no one who'd been paying attention. Caleb Holt filed for legal guardianship of Norah Bell Hayes in January, with letters of support from McAllister, Dorothy, Margaret, Reverend Alcott, Birchall, and the feed merchant, whose name turned out to be Samuel Grady, and who wrote, in his letter, that he had seen the child stand in the snow and speak truth to a powerful man without flinching, and that this was more evidence of sound character than most adults managed in a lifetime. The guardianship was granted in April. By then they were living in a 2-room cabin on the south edge of Salvation Creek that Caleb had built through the winter, working on the good days when the weather allowed, and planning on the bad days when it didn't. Norah helped where she could and supervised where she couldn't, which mostly meant she stood in the doorway of whatever room he was working in and told him when his measurements were off, which they were less often than she implied. She was reading fluently by March. By April, she was ahead of every other child in Dorothy's classroom, not because she worked harder than them, though she did, but because she'd been starving for it for 7 years, and the appetite that had built up in that time was not going to be satisfied quickly. She still kept the Wilt's tooth charm. She'd moved it from the cord around her neck to the windowsill above her bed, where she could see it in the morning, and where, she told Caleb once, it reminded her that her father had given her something real, something she could hold. She didn't leave it in the snow the way Ruth Cooper had left her rock, because she was not Ruth Cooper, and this was not that story. And she had learned that not all things that helped you survive needed to be set down when the surviving was finished. Some things you kept. Some things you carried forward into the life on the other side. Margaret Coldwell came for Sunday dinner every week without being asked after the 3rd Sunday, when she'd brought a pot of stew and Norah had eaten 3 bowls and told her it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. And Margaret had said, "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." And Norah had said, "What reputation?" And for the first time in 14 years, Margaret Coldwell had laughed out loud until she had to sit down. Dorothy came on Tuesdays and Thursdays for lessons and stayed for dinner more often than not. And what was happening between her and Caleb, in the measured increments of proximity that the dinners allowed, was something Norah tracked with the attention she gave to everything important. And she didn't comment on it, except once, in March, when she looked up from her primer and said, "Miss Dorothy's eyes do a thing when you talk." And Caleb said, "What kind of thing?" And Norah said, "The kind that means it," and went back to her reading. By April, Caleb thought she was right. What he knew for certain, on the morning the guardianship papers came through, and Norah sat at the kitchen table reading her name on the official document, Norah Bell Hayes, ward and legal charge of Caleb Elias Holt, Salvation Creek, Wyoming Territory, and traced each letter with her finger, the way she'd learned to trace letters in the beginning, carefully, making sure they were real. What he knew for certain was this. He had ridden into Salvation Creek on a December night with a lame horse and nowhere particular to be, 3 years into a life built around moving and not looking at what he was moving away from. He had found a child in a horse stall who bit him to the bone and looked at him with eyes that had already decided all adults were liars. She had been wrong about him. He had been wrong about himself for 3 years. Wrong about what he was capable of, wrong about what he deserved, wrong about the idea that a man defined by his worst moment was finished becoming anything better. Norah Bell Hayes, with her wolf's tooth charm and her measuring eyes and her voice that said true things plainly and her memory that held everything and let go of nothing she needed. She had not rescued him. That was not the shape of it, and it would not be honest to call it that. But she had stood in the snow and looked Harrison Greer in the eye without blinking and said, "I was always listening." And something in that, in the absolute refusal to be invisible, to be discounted, to accept that the world's arrangements were the only possible arrangements, something in that had reached into the locked part of Caleb's chest and turned the key. She looked up from the paper and found him watching her, and she said, "It's real," with the same plainness she used for everything. "It's real," he said. She put her hand flat on the document and looked at it for a long moment. And then she looked up at him, and the expression on her face was not the guarded, measuring look, and it was not the ancient patience of a child who had survived everything, and it was not the fierce, controlled courage of someone who had learned that hope was dangerous and had chosen it anyway. It was just Norah, 7 years old, and finally, fully, completely at home in a world that had finally, completely made room for her. "Okay," she said, for the third and last time, and meant it with everything she had. Outside, the Wyoming winter was ending. The snow that had come in December and built itself into walls and locked the roads and pressed down on Salvation Creek for 3 months was retreating from the edges, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the way winter always retreated, slowly, and then all at once. And the ground underneath was coming back, dark and cold and hard-worked and ready, the way ground was ready after a long winter, patient and full of everything it had been saving up, waiting for the season that always came, even when it seemed like it wouldn't. Even when the cold had gone on so long you'd stop believing in the thing on the other side of it. The thing on the other side of it was spring, and it was here.